Hi, this is John Firth, and I'm sitting here with my friend Neil Pessin, who is also a coach with executives over 50. And this is the seventh in our fall series of Firth and Friends. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to both our hearts and hopefully to those listening, which is those moments when we have to make important decisions, not decisions about whether or not we go shopping or if we go see a friend, but those potentially life-altering, at least important decisions. And I think we all can have our own idea of what that is. And what happens when we have problems with decision? And we're going to talk about the fundamental fact that decisions may be informed by our brains, but they are never made by our brains. They're made by, for lack of a better anatomical metaphor, by our gut and by our heart. And that's where we get into trouble. But I'm going to let Neil introduce himself, and then we're going to jump into the topic. And please feel free to make comments or ask us questions. So take it away, Neil.
Hi, I'm Neil Pessin. Let me give a one-moment background. I was the founder of a large behavioral health organization and ran that organization for years. I'm a psychologist by profession and trade. I've done a number of organizational events and constructions and put together a coalition and dealt with a number of executives who are struggling with their own growth.
Yeah, some don't even know what growth means. And some of them are just plain afraid of it because it's so different and you're going into uncharted territory, which leads us naturally to our topic. Often decisions are made in uncertain times, and a decision by nature is a bet into the future. And of course, we can't tell the future, but as we get older, in theory, our wisdom and experience grows so that we do make better decisions, perhaps. But Neil, let's talk a little bit about what's going on underneath the surface, say like ground zero level, when we're struggling with decisions. What are some of the hallmarks that people can see or feel if they're in tune with themselves that may be getting in the way of good decisions?
Well, I think there are lots of them. There are internal ones, which I like to think of because that's sort of my background. And then I think there are external ones that I think is everybody's background. But I think identifying all of those issues is the cornerstone for being successful at being able to attenuate them. I think many of us become experienced in the jobs we do, maybe the schools we go to, and we believe that we are okay, and then find ourselves performing in ways that we didn't expect to perform, or others are relating to us in other ways. I'll give you one example for myself. Early on, I changed careers, and I was becoming successful. I always did well in school, so I was successful there. And everybody around me believed that I was successful in every way that they admired, except my personal life was falling apart. And that leaked into all the things that I did at work. And it was somewhat invisible until those dam breaks and a lot of emotions enter the conversations you're having on a professional level. I would have liked to have been informed before that dam broke that there was a leak, and that my personal issues were now contaminating the job that I thought I was doing so very, very well. So I think sort of getting a grasp of what is going on inside of you and what is going on, believing my friends saying you're doing great was reinforcement in the wrong direction for me. So how do you give that up and be aware? It's a hard question to ask, and it's a hard solution to find, but I think it behooves us to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the emotions. I would put that all into lack of information or disinformation, bad feedback from your friends, not knowing yourself well enough, not understanding the ramification of certain decisions. So I put that in the character, just some general lack of information and understanding. It's interesting you do bring up emotions because we do often say the brain gets in the way. And we'll talk maybe in a second about what emotions really are. But in my case, I think some of the worst decisions are when I'm faced with potential failure. and I have a particularly hard time with failure. I'm a hyperachiever. So I've walked away from situations in extremely abrupt, very bad ways when I just thought I was going to fail. So instead of just failing and learning from it, living with it, I walk away from a situation so I can at least lie to myself. I didn't fail. I walked away, quote unquote, with my head up high. And those, of course, were impulsive decisions. Impulsivity can be one of the big detriment to, or lack of time as well, to make good decisions. What are some other examples?
So, I mean, just to sort of follow that thought, I think in the same vein, do the opposite. Instead of walking away, I walk in. So I'm a practice guy. I always felt that I played sports, got a scholarship to go to college to play sports. And what I couldn't do, I would practice until I could do it. And then, of course, there's always the next you can't do well. So you always have to practicing. And there's a point where I'm not saying one should accept their limitations as much as one should appreciate their limitations and work with what you have as opposed to what you wish to have. I think, especially for high achievers, and if in particular you're a perfectionist, you never want to miss that shot. And if you do, you're going to go in the gym. I mean, I had a whole thing about foul shots. I thought I should never, ever, ever miss a foul shot because there's nobody defending you. How could you fail there? And yet you do miss foul shots on occasion. But it was unacceptable for me. And I raised the bar to an unacceptable level of achievement.
Yeah. So I would say old habits die hard. So you get into the definition of insanity. You keep doing the same old thing because you see a situation that looks somewhat similar and you just lapse into an old way of thinking, old way of deciding that may not be appropriate. Also, misunderstanding the situation, misreading cues, I think is often the case, often having to do with lack of empathy, not understanding the people you're dealing with. And with that, I would also say not really understanding the art of long-term thinking. These are important decisions, and often it's an old analogy, but it works for me, a game of chess. You always have to be at 4 or 5 moves ahead to understand if the move you're about to make is going to take you in that direction. It's also a lack of intentionality can be a cause of it. We'd also talk about the imposter syndrome, the anxieties that come along with making big decisions. If you've never made that kind of a decision before, you have a lot riding on it. Just saw a video about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was one of those extremely difficult decisions for one man, Kennedy. And you can argue whether or not he made the right decision, but that was probably a very agonizing decision where he needed lots of information and he needed to put a lot of stuff aside. Preconceived notions can also cause bad decisions.
I mean, we're most of us are not good at accepting who we are, where we are at the moment, and growing in a direction that we can best benefit. We're not always good at making the right choices. We're good at plowing forward, and sort of pardon my sports analogies. It's sort of like football. You put your shoulder down and you run hard. That's not a solution to a lot of subtle questions.
Right.
And when you're working with people, if you're a leader, and being a leader isn't about putting your shoulder down and plowing through. It's about listening and learning and accepting and then rechurning it and coming up with more solutions for other people to weigh in on.
Yeah. We're talking, of course, non-emergency solutions. I mean, if, I was at Discovery and our broadcast facility in Miami went down, I think, with the hurricane. Now, that wasn't something we were able to fix in a few hours. The hurricane had to pass, but we quickly had to get on it because we had affiliate dollars that were being spent. We had advertising dollars. So we had to group around the problem very, very fast. In that case, you do rely more on instinct, which I think brings us to the next topic. But first, I just want to remind everybody, you're watching Neil Pessin and myself discuss Too Smart for Your Own Good. I've been called that quite a lot. And it's about how things, especially our brain, can get in the way of good decision-making. And we are talking about a group called Executives Over 50, where in theory, our decision-making should get better by virtue of experience and knowledge and a little gray hair. But that isn't necessarily the case. So, Neil, we were talking about various things that can get in the way of good decision making. Now let's talk about the brain and how the brain works and how the brain gets brought in on something and then should be sometimes taken out of at least some decisions. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure, and let me hook it to the last thing you said before the advertisement. The I think we're all faced with what we think are emergencies and what are in fact emergencies, and life and death is one certainly very, very dramatic version of an emergency. And I've done enough crisis work over time for lots of things like World Trade Center bombing more than once, and a bunch of other things. Fortunately, not at that level, but important enough. And there is a moment where you just have to bark orders because things have to move now. And hopefully that you prepared people around you that that's the way it's going to have to be. But there are also people who, and I think that's part of understanding yourself. In the moment when there is a crisis, how do you act? Are you somebody who moves in and is involved in the solution, or are you somebody who steps back and has to reflect on it for a moment to be reorganized? Or you're somebody who freezes. And I mean, I had this conversation, we had this conversation. Bush, during the 9/11, was sitting in a classroom for 7 minutes, not moving, literally not moving. And clearly, he wasn't the guy who moves in, though his job as president was to do so. We can't always live up to the expectations of others or the job's responsibilities, and we need to know that.
Right, right. And I think that's the conundrum of any leader, any CEO is CEOs are trained. I mean, I train my entrepreneurs to become CEOs, and that's about longer term thinking. Many of them have built their companies because they're good at sales, but sales is a short term action. And in fact, the shorter the better, because that's what brings revenue in. And if you wait too long, obviously you'll have problems with revenue. Whereas being a CEO, a decision maker of an entire organization, requires some thought. Now, in emergencies, I think it's a great example because in most emergencies, our brain tunes out really fast, and instinct, our survival instinct takes over, and because it's primordial, we instinctively know to survive we have to get out of the way of a train coming towards you. You have to make sure you don't hop into the lion cage. There's certain things that are just instinctive, but it's the other ones that we get ourselves in trouble. I've been called too smart for my own good. That can result very easily in analysis paralysis. And as a consultant, unfortunately, the way we were paid, we actually reveled in analysis paralysis because that's what we were getting paid for. And the secret to success as a consultant, strategy consultant, was to be able to give the CEO what he or she needed, or his leadership team, to make a decision, because you provide them with everything, quote unquote, they know, and then they take their own experience and bring it in. They still got in the back of the head the stuff they've learned, but what I think we often did as strategy consultants is we trained the brain so that if it was a decision that hadn't been made before, or was very important or something, or where you had a lot of people involved, that at some point people felt they had the information, and then they got instinct. But what are some of the examples in your life where that didn't happen quite so well, where suddenly the brain kicked in?
Oh, there are many, and that sort of the overarching, the umbrella for this is you will make mistakes. Can you recover? Can you learn from those mistakes? I'll share one that was earlier on in my career. As I said before, I had another career where I was successful at that, and went back to get retrained and re-educated, and I was now in a place at Einstein, I was at Einstein in those days, learning about family therapy. And I had a family that I had seen before and I was seeing again, and felt I was comfortable. Did not read the temperature in the room that they were probably less comfortable with me than I was with them. The dad was sort of northern Bronx Italian family construction worker. Mom was very depressed in those days. We used to call it evolutional depression. It's probably biological. And then they had an adult daughter who was dying of melanoma. So in conversation, I say, to the room, but mostly to Dad, "These are hard times. It must be frightening," because that's how I felt.
Right, exactly.
And he gets up and walks to the door, muttering, "I ain't scared of nothing," and turns to me and says, "You think being smart is a redeeming quality?" A phrase I have never forgotten, and he was absolutely right. I was convinced I was right about what I said, that the temperature in the room was. He wasn't prepared to hear it. If he's not prepared to hear it, it was valueless. In fact, it was corrosive.
Yes.
And he never came back. I learned a harsh lesson, and the harshness was more for them than it was for me. I beat myself up for a while for what I couldn't do well because, like as we said before, not doing well is not acceptable to me. And when
achievers, it's not. It's a
and
problem.
when it involves other people, it's especially not. I have often used that phrase in teaching people and use that example because it was very meaningful to me. And I think that it's not like that was the last time I misspoke. It was the last time I misspoke and didn't catch myself.
Right.
Somewhere in there, I've learned. I mean, used to be a comedian, for those who know, Johnny Carson, whose art wasn't just being funny up front with jokes. His art was recovering from bad jokes. So I've learned in the course of that is like, oops, I think I misspoke. Conversation embedded in it because I hear myself, which is the first step to never saying the wrong thing. But you have to get to that never saying the wrong thing by practicing being you. And it's not like being intelligent isn't a value. It's not the only value.
Right. And now we're getting also a little into science, because what is intelligence and exactly how does it exhibit itself?
I also think it's how your brain works. I mean, many of us who, especially if you're a high achiever, is a problem solver. Right. And in the course of a problem, the problem is solved in your own head to your own satisfaction. When it involves another, then the conversation of how impactful you are in describing a solution without being autocratic is very hard in becoming a good leader. You have to bring people to the problem and engage them in solving the problem as opposed to just barking an order.
Right.
So I think that's where we often sabotage ourselves. We don't stop and take reflection on that. We don't take guidance from others sometimes. We don't hear it, and therefore it isn't real. Right. And to be able to take a step back and reflect is an art we need to grow.
Right. And maybe I can make that a little concrete. At least my experience has been that when you learn how to get out of your head, literally, be on the other side with people, we call it often the what if, what's in it for me syndrome, where you are constantly aware of what the person wants, how they're reacting to what you're saying, requires you to step out, literally outside of yourself, and be on the other side with the other person. That also includes meetings where you've got a leadership team and they're feeding you input and so forth. I think for me, when I'm not listening to others, when I'm not on the other side, and it's not always easy, that's when I start to go awry. And I think I'm a very intuitive person. I'm an ENTJ for what it's worth, which means when I don't listen to my intuition, I generally get myself into trouble. And it's very hard with all the noise in the world, and you have people chattering at you and so forth, to constantly go back into myself after I've listened to everybody and gathered what I needed to say what my heart really thinks and my gut. And those moments when I'm able to say, I don't care what anybody says, and I've heard you all, but my gut tells me. And I can think of many instances where I've wavered and not listened to my gut and made a decision and immediately regretted it. Everything from buying a house in 2005 in Washington because the closing costs were paid for by Discovery, because Discovery was in DC and not in New York. That was an incentive. For some reason, the minute I bought that apartment, it was a big one, it was a nice one, kind of I would never be able to afford in New York City, I thought to myself, did I make a mistake? Now, at that moment, the housing market was on fire. There was really very little thing to believe that we were about to get what we got a year and a half later, which was the meltdown of the mortgage market, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there was something inside me that said, oops, you might have made a mistake. I can't explain it, but there was something about it. And lo and behold, I lost my job in 2007 in June, I think, and things started melting down in July, August. Fortunately, I didn't have to think very quickly. I wanted to go back to New York. We decided very definitely that was our goal. And then I had no other choice. Sell the apartment, just sell it as fast as possible, because I knew rent would not cover the cost, and I didn't want to get stuck with this thing in Washington, where I was barely, not even covering probably the interest payments. So because rents just were too low. And boy, I think I lost money on it, but boy, I think of what it could have been if I had waited just even 3 or 4 months later. So, so there is, at least my experience has been, there is this voice of intuition, and as you say, getting to know yourself, I think also implies getting to know when your intuition is trying to say something and trying to get through the noise that starts accumulating.
You bring up an additional factor in what you're describing. It's a good example. Is that we're often impatient to share the bright idea and not get buy-in and bring people along with us. If we're talking about our own decision, about our own life, then you either do or don't pay the consequences, and it works or it doesn't work. And maybe other than your mate, nobody's affected by buying an apartment. But I think if you're an executive, by definition, it means that people report to you and that you're overseeing a portfolio of things to do, whatever the industry is. And I think the idea of buy-in sometimes escapes people who are in a hurry or people who are anxious, and then they wonder why nobody signs up for their project and nobody's following, or they're dragging their feet, or whatever version of that word. And sometimes it just means patience, even though you know the right answer. There might also be another right answer out there.
Exactly.
In life, there's not, it's not so simple. It's not binary for most things. So I think the idea that we are patient about bringing people into the conversation, even if you have to tolerate the pace that you're feeling uncomfortable with, the end product often is a greater reward.
And again, it depends on the timelines. We have to always be aware that every decision, whether it's explicitly stated or not, has some sort of timeline to it. There are some that decisions have to be made quickly. Let's say you discover that an employee did something wrong, not so wrong that's obviously broke a law or something, but calls into question their viability as an employee. They're talking, they say things, you discover they're saying bad things about you throughout the organization. It's been poisoning the well. Well, that's what I would call not a pretty short-term decision. You have to decide whether that employee is worth keeping, or you have to put them on a PIP, a performance improvement plan, or you just fire them. And that's a decision as a CEO generally when they come up, and it doesn't happen often, where you have to make a decision within a certain amount of hours, because you don't want the thing to go on sort of making life worse. But then those strategic decisions about a new product line, launching a new product, that can take years in some cases. You have a series of decisions, but you have to have that first commitment decision that you're going to follow whatever you need to do, research and development and so forth, to a certain point based on timelines and budgets and what have you. And those are pretty momentous decisions. And I think those are the ones where your brain really does have to kick in at some point because of all the inputs you're going to have to go with. But even then, my experience has been at that moment of what I call the commitment, not even a decision, but a commitment. It has to be a quick commitment. It has to be something that's unequivocal, yes or no. And if yes, how? Because at that point, you should know enough to be able to say, I understand the pathway there, or at least I see it. And those are those moments that I think people can get really screwed up on, is when it becomes a commitment. Because decisions, at the heart of decision is the Latin term side, which means death, which means in some cases you make decisions that's killed off any going back, any options. You're committing $1 million to developing a new product. It's going to be very hard to reverse that, especially in a big organization. But life is full of also a lot of choices. And I think choices are some cases a little bit easier to trust your gut because you don't feel like you're having so much that rides on it.
So I guess my frame for that conversation was about team building. Yeah, of course, you walk over to somebody and they're filling in a form with blue ink, and you say, no, you must fill it out with black ink. That's not a lot of conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
But to your point, somebody is messing up in a big way that has potential down the road catastrophic effects. You need to address it right then. That's your job.
Right.
But I think of the job of most executives is not as a policeman for things. It's about a catalyst for growth, and the ultimate decision is yours. So how do you get to that decision? I'm sure you have. I know I have made decisions about things that others have brought to me in their own construction of it. Which in my head, I think my way is better, but we'll go with your way because it'll be sturdier at the end than if I just sort of tell you what to do.
Right.
Especially on larger projects. Small projects, most people don't care. But larger, let's bring in, as you described, we're bringing in a product, we're sort of building it. Being smart on others is not really an effective way to do team building or to get the folks that you're hoping that you're mentoring along the way, because I think a good leader mentors, without bringing their conversation into you. I think that's where we often fail because we're in a hurry. We see the answers. Some of us are more visionary than others. Some are great strategists than others. And a lot of staff have to learn how to not be tacticians, to step up to being strategists, and hopefully, if they got it, to be visionaries. And unless you train them to do that by example, it's not going to happen very well. So I think we need to step out of our own sort of eagerness to go fast.
Eagerness and ego.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't, I mean, it's often been very exciting, sometimes stunning to me that how many other people have really good ideas.
Oh yeah, no. The number of times that I have this group of entrepreneurs and I coach them on the side before we come to group meetings, and I've gotten to a point now where if there's a real problem that I'm hashing through one-on-one, I often will say we need to bring this to the group because I know there are other ideas than what I have right now, and it's amazing how something will percolate almost out of nowhere, and suddenly you've got this idea, and often it's stuff that's right in front of your face that you didn't see. Which is kind of an interesting conundrum. But I think, at the end of the day, being a team leader, we're talking now about leadership, is in some ways putting your ego, in your eagerness and your ambition and so forth to one side for the greater good.
Or your neuroses. There are tons of us, me included, who live with a sense of being an imposter. And you hopefully you can, it's like being shy or being an introvert. You can learn the behaviors that make you look otherwise, but you're still living inside of you is that person who'd rather not to speak to somebody, or living inside of you is the getting exhausted by going to a networking event when you have to look cheerful. And I think I'll give you I'll give you one example about imposter syndrome. So here I was back in school, and another journey another time, and I did what you're supposed to do, and I finished what it was. I made a stupid mistake, and I found something in the scientific world that my dissertation was going to be based on, which nobody had done before. Big mistake when you're getting a dissertation done. The caveat was make the frogs like twitch, and you're done. And I did it, and it was accepted, and you get all these things, and your thesis now is in the Library of Congress as if anybody will ever read it. And 7 years later, I woke up after I got my certificate, and I woke up and I felt relief, and I thought there must be a statute of limitation about being caught with something that was wrong. And there is no statute of limitation. It was my statute of limitation. I had given up the sub rosa anxiety around that, saying enough, and I couched it as some legal process, which it really isn't. So all to say is, we're not always aware of the stream that's running below,
Right.
we're performing and living, and it can happen. I mean, I've gone to, as an inherently shy person, gone to networking meetings and like, I don't know if I said anything worthwhile, and people around me feel like, great, let's follow up, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But so I think being aware of sabotaging yourself in that way, and making a decision based on something that is internal, that's sort of leaking out, is something we need to be aware of. And I think making bad decisions in that, and couched in that, could often be hopefully not catastrophic, but certainly destructive.
Yeah. So we have a comment. Fortunately, it's a LinkedIn user without a name, but they say, "Good morning, gentlemen." So it's obviously a friend. So good morning. That came in about 5 minutes ago. Yeah, so I think I'd like to end it up with talking about what goes on in our brains. So in my case, I've taken a course called Positive Intelligence. It's a coaching program developed at Stanford Business School. And what it really teaches you is there are certain behaviors you take on as a child to get the affection and the protection you need. And oh, it's Donna. Hey, Donna Arendt. Hope you're doing well. Hope this is helpful. There are certain behaviors you take on that it just naturally result in decisions about how you're going to act, behaviors you're going to engage in, things you're going to do to get the attention and love of your parents. Those are unfortunately behaviors that carried into adulthood often appear to still be useful, and often are, but can sabotage you. And that is literally the brain taking over. The brain will engage in a behavior and say, this is the outcome I expect. And just the opposite happens, usually because of fear and anxiety that gets in the way, that causes you just to revert to old behaviors. In my case, it's a need for achievement, it's a need to control, and a need to put some order together. Now, that sounds all great. In fact, it's what made me a very good CEO. But when that goes bad, when the anxiety, when the fears, when the judgment comes forward, it takes me into the amygdala, and that's only a fight or flight response, not very useful. But it's actually the brain that's wiring it that way, as opposed to going to the prefrontal cortex, where creativity, language, mathematics, and so forth live, where, outside of talking about the gut and the heart, is where suddenly you aren't sabotaging yourself in particular decisions. I don't know if you have another way of looking at it.
Do you have an example that you want to give us?
Oh, I have some big examples of things went wrong. I think it was when I was running the trade association for the consulting industry, and I'd done great. I'd turned it around. It was almost bankrupt and so forth. And that was because I listened to my second in command, who had a skill set that I do not have very, very much of, which is cost control. I'm terrible. I just like to spend my way to success. And I fired inadvertently her assistant in a big confusing mess of miscommunication. She turned around and sued the association and me. The board took care of it, but I was tarnished. And we had to do trainings, and they never let me sort of forget it, although they didn't fire me. After a year, I said, I can't turn the situation around. It's just getting worse. I'm not feeling successful. I'm feeling like a failure. I don't like that feeling. So I'm just going to up and walk out. Literally at the annual meeting, told everybody to go do themselves, and walked out, thinking I was holding my head high. But it was a saboteur just raging in my head. The voices going, failure, never turn around, get out of here, get out of here. It was the amygdala going, flee, 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 flee. A little bit of fight and then run. And that was totally how I sabotaged myself, because unknowingly I threw myself into a bit of a tailspin professionally and personally. So that's the example I always use of my saboteurs, just absolutely taking control of my actions, and me literally, in this case, maybe not thinking, but my brain was going where the voices were in the brain telling me to get out of there.
And your heart's racing, and you feel enraged.
I'm feeling misused and disregarded, and I did all this work and they don't take it honestly. It really was the brain going haywire.
Well, and as it approaches your emotions. So I think there are 2 or 3 sort of emotional states that I think people get into, and they come from what you're describing as the origins. I think, and it happens. The outcomes for that you can see in the workplace, like codependence, the desire and need to be loved by anybody, even people who don't deserve your love. And as a manager, a leader, the idea that you have to be nice to everybody is a good idea. I think one should always be nice to everybody, but not nice to a place where you're not effective any longer.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
or anxiety. Everything. Kids are born with a temperament, and there's some of us born with what looks like anxiety that's not labeled as an infant yet, but it certainly turns out to be, and as we grow. And anxiety becomes the driver of decision making as opposed to rational thinking. And how do you sort of step the anxiety back and not be blurting out words and being impulsive, being angry? I once was in a meeting with somebody who was a chronic talker. I mean, he could not stop talking. There was no break in her sentences, no commas or periods in her dialogue. And I met with her for years. And one day at a meeting in my office, we're sitting around the round table in my office, and I turned to her and said, would you just stop talking? And it certainly satisfied my instant need. It was silence in the room.
But it was also your brain turning off and saying, "That's not what you're saying. You just said what needed to be said."
It was my professional road rage. I just couldn't take it anymore.
Right.
And I could have stepped away. I could have done a million other things. There are lots of other strategies for dealing with it. But I had not paid attention to where I was going. And I went to a place I didn't want to be. So I think, go ahead.
But I was going to say, in those cases, and I was very much a victim of this, is your need to appear social, keep the team feeling good about things, blah, blah, that's your brain saying, be careful, be careful. It's like the warning signals that are indeed what our brain was meant to be. It was really short-term impulses meant that this thing was building up, building up, building up. And what needed to be said came out then, like a punch or like a cannonball.
As the words are coming out of my mouth, I knew they were wrong.
Right. Had you said it earlier, or had you not let your brain convince you to do otherwise,
I knew this one
a little bit differently.
I knew this one for years. I could have said something more constructive. Whether I could have stopped her from talking or not, I don't know. But you can have a conversation saying, you really sometimes dominate the conversation. It would be helpful to let other people sort of have their voice in it, because I don't think that they have the room to do that.
Yeah.
So that, or anything even softer than that. But I didn't have to yell at her in public.
Yeah, no, that yelling at people in public, especially an important person, part of a leadership team, never goes well.
Anybody. Should yell at anybody.
Anybody. Yeah.
So also, being on top of what is a driver for you comes from an archaic place, maybe. And that comment, fighting with my chronic need to make sure everybody's okay, was in conflict. And I didn't deal with the conflict very well. So lesson learned. I learned about that, and it helped me in other situations as well. But I think the point you're making, and the point I'm trying to reinforce, is some of these things come from an early learning that teach you and your brain and then your emotional system to coordinate in another way, whether you're going to get mom's attention chronically, whether or not you're going to get friends in the community based on that relationship, which you didn't feel was enough or secure enough to have rapprochement, to be able to leave. And I think I don't want to get too shrinky about it, but the whole goal, I think, for me anyway, for us, is to know ourselves as well as we can, so that we can perform the best that we can.
Exactly. And I would take that one step further. When we get to know ourselves and to love ourselves, then we can get to know others and love them too. And the empathy, which is for me the key to what I call the ultimate goal of any of this, which is wisdom. Wisdom is defined as the ability to activate, to innovate, to navigate, to to have empathy, to be able to be in a place where your gut instincts, your what you know is best deep down comes through much easier and without a lot of this noise, which is the saboteurs, anxieties, fears, whatever you want to call them. For me, that's how I think about my journey and journey of my clients, which is march towards wisdom. And wisdom isn't sitting here and being smart, too smart for your own good, but it's actually getting back onto the court and taking action and making good decisions a lot easier and with a lot less turmoil and fighting and needless energy.
And sometimes what I think you're describing is also identifying, but also relabeling. So empathy for some people feels like weakness. Empathy for me is a strength.
Yes.
So giving to others is an opportunity for us to learn, to us to engage, and us to help others grow better than they are now. Because that's our job.
Exactly. Tough love in some cases.
Well, you know,
Okay, that means
everybody growth is tough.
Yeah. No pain, no gain. A lot of stock phrases.
Yeah, and keep practicing it is sort of the message. But get good information from hopefully yourself, but
From an outside party.
Other people as well. Because if you're not listening, you're not going to be able to get the best out of yourself.
Exactly. And if you don't ask good questions, then you're going to be listening to things that maybe you shouldn't be listening to. But I see our time is up. In terms of external help, executives over 50, if you're an executive over 50 who is facing a career challenge or a life challenge, it does get different. It becomes different in your mid 50s than before. In my case, I would say it's been both better and both more difficult than what came before, but we're here to help. And both of us are coaches, and in one case, a psychologist, one case, someone who was told I missed my calling by not becoming a psychiatrist, but I'm just fascinated by people. I love to help people, and I think Neil does too. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Donna and John Caston and Amy Abush. All of you made comments. This is one of the first LinkedIn Lives that we've had so many comments from our listeners. So I hope this was helpful and hit the mark. And we look forward to seeing perhaps in further LinkedIn Lives and LinkedIn audio events. They're always Wednesdays at 12 p.m., i.e. 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. So thank you, Neil, and thank you to our listeners.
Take care, be well.
Bye-bye.